Okay, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling the third and final pillar of sustainability, the social pillar.
That's right.
We've pulled together a stack of articles, research, notes, looking at this really complex area, especially how it, intersects with fields like civil engineering.
Exactly. And our mission, really, in this deep dive is to try and extract the most important insights, the frameworks from all this material.
To help you, the listener, understand what the social pillar is, how people are thinking about quantifying it.
Yeah, and how it's being considered in practice, particularly in things like building infrastructure.
And in right away, we have to acknowledge the big challenge here, don't we? The social pillar is widely seen as the least quantified.
Oh, absolutely. It's the hardest to put concrete numbers on compared to the other two pillars.
Definitely. Think about the economic pillar we've got, establish metrics like Lifecycle Cost Analysis.
LCCA, yeah. Looking at costs over the entire life of a project.
Rate of return, benefit cost ratio, present worth. Pretty clear ways to assign monetary value.
hmm And the environmental pillar has its metrics too. Lifecycle Assessment, LCA.
Environmental product declarations, those EPDs, basically standardized reports on a product's environmental impact.
Right. Plus, specific measurements for emissions, waste, ecological concepts like ecological footprint or planetary boundaries. They give us quantifiable data.
Data to compare options, yeah.
But then we turn to the social pillar, and it gets, well, trickier. The material we look at highlights several reasons why.
Okay.
For one, it's simply a newer area of focus in this sustainability context. It hasn't been explored as deeply or for as long.
Right. Not like economics or even environmental science in some ways.
And it seems many of the core concepts come from fields like sociology or urban planning, community development.
Fields that approach quantification very differently than, say, engineering does.
Exactly. Concepts like social capital or community attachment. They're hugely important for well-being, for quality of life.
But applying them directly to designing, I don't know, a standard new bridge or an office building project, that's just not straightforward, is it?
It really isn't. The
Oh.
sources do mention exceptions, like historic building renovations, where community attachment did clearly play a big role in the project's success or perceived value.
Sure, you can see that. But that's not the typical infrastructure project, as you said.
No.
So developing those consistent, reliable metrics for the social pillar, what are the big hurdles our material points to?
Well, the first one that jumps out is relevance across different societal groups.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
It means what's a priority for, say, a university student in a city like Fayetteville might be completely different from what matters most to a long-term resident who's lived there for decades.
Right. How do you create one metric that captures the needs and values of both? Very different perspectives.
Exactly. And then there's the scale of application. Ideally, a metric needs to work locally, regionally, maybe statewide, even nationally.
But places are so different.
It's so different. Fayetteville isn't a stand-in for all of Arkansas, and Arkansas is vastly different from, say, California. A metric that's perfect in one spot might just not apply in another.
Makes sense.
And the unequal geographic distribution of populations adds another layer of complexity.
How so?
Well, one report used the example of Illinois. You've got the Chicago area with most of the state's population, but it covers a small geographic area,
Right, very dense.
which creates vastly different transportation priorities compared to downstate Illinois, where mass transit infrastructure is much less developed or non-existent in places.
Yeah, roadway needs, transit access. They're going to look totally different in a dense city versus a rural area. What metric works for both?
It's a real challenge. And critically, there's the time horizon issue.
Ah, right. Things change.
Social dynamics can change surprisingly fast. Think about something simple like a survey on preferred room temperature or noise level.
Yeah, my preference changes depending on the time of day.
Exactly. Or the season, or who's in the room. This kind of short time horizon is incredibly challenging for long-term planning.
Especially for expensive infrastructure projects designed to last 50, 70, maybe 100 years.
Precisely. And what we found in the sources is that social metrics often rely on cross-sectional data,
Meaning?
essentially snapshots,
Hmm.
looking at individuals or communities at one specific moment in time.
Okay, I see. So trying to predict future social trends for a century-long project based on that single snapshot.
It's really difficult, especially for engineers used to more predictable things like material properties or, traffic growth model.
Yeah, much more tangible.
So it forces us to confront these fundamental questions when trying to measure the social pillar.
Hmm.
What level of society are we actually targeting with this metric?
Okay.
Who specifically are we targeting within that level?
Right.
And maybe the toughest one, who gets to decide the answer to those first two questions?
Oof. Yeah, those are big questions. These are tough challenges, no doubt about it.
Idar.
But the material we reviewed also conveys a sense of, I don't know, potential and excitement about developing better social metrics. It feels like an area ripe for innovation.
It absolutely is. And
Yeah.
it's not like nothing's been done. The sources show that work is already underway. There are existing concepts, tools being explored.
Okay, good. So despite those challenges, engineers are starting to tackle this. Where are we seeing those first steps or existing approaches within civil engineering?
Well, we can look at fundamental principles from organizations like ASCE, the American Society of Civil Engineers,
Okay.
their code of ethics, their guiding principles. They talk about ensuring safe infrastructure, protecting public health and welfare,
There's engineering stuff, yeah.
but also promoting inclusive, equitable, and ethical behavior.
Mm.
These core ideas, while maybe not direct metrics themselves, they serve as foundational anchors.
Kind of starting points for defining who we're targeting and thinking about the level of impact we care about.
Exactly. They give you that grounding.
And specifically for transportation, the material pointed to resources like NCHRP, the National Cooperative Highway Research Program.
Right. There's a key research publication, Report 456, from back in 2001, actually, by Falk and Brock. It lists potential metrics relevant to highway projects.
Like what?
Things like travel time, safety, vehicle operating costs, transportation choice, accessibility. Some are easier to measure than others.
Right, you can quantify traffic noise with a decibel reader. Easy enough.
Sure. But then they also list things like community cohesion.
Yeah. That sounds harder to put a number on.
Explicitly listed as being harder, even though it's recognized as a really important social impact.
Okay. So that's early work. What else?
Moving forward a bit, a study published in a transportation journal by Lucas in 2007 proposed even more detailed metrics, really looking at transportation impacts on the social pillar.
How so?
They defined poverty, for example, not just by income, but by the total household expenditure on travel.
Oh, interesting. Both in dollars and as a percentage of income.
Exactly. Highlighting the financial burden that just getting around can place on vulnerable populations.
That's a different way of looking at it. Not just can you get there, but can you afford to get there?
Precisely.
Yeah.
They also looked at accessibility by measuring trip lengths from home to key places. Employment, education, healthcare, food shops.
Yeah.
Is essential stuff actually reachable?
Makes sense? And safety.
Measured specifically by child pedestrian casualties per 1,000 children. So focusing on a very specific vulnerable group.
Okay.
And quality of life was linked to living within a kilometer or maybe a 15-minute walk to facilities like schools, healthcare, leisure, food shops, post office.
Especially if there's safe walking infrastructure provided.
Yes, that was a key qualifier.
And they even connected it to housing.
Yeah, looking at the lowest 10% of house prices within an average journey time to these quality of life areas.
Wow. So really trying to link the built environment, transportation access to social outcomes and equity.
Definitely. The core insight here is shifting how we define transportation success. It's not just about traffic speed or volume anymore.
It's about whether transportation enables access to basic needs, doesn't cripple people financially, ensures safety, especially for kids.
It's a massive reframing.
Mm.
And these metrics try to capture that shift.
And that perspective is echoed elsewhere too, right? I think Guthway's 2017 research was mentioned.
Yes, focusing specifically on the planning side, examining accessibility impacts of proposed transit projects.
With objectives like maximizing social benefits of public investments and increasing access to jobs in historically disadvantaged areas.
Exactly. And we saw in the data a TUIO 2019 survey looking at how MPOs, the Metropolitan Planning Organizations, are actually starting to formalize planning for social equity.
And considering the impact of emerging technologies, too. So these ideas are making their way into planning agencies.
Slowly, perhaps, but yes.
And finally, a more recent tool highlighted was the USC Social Vulnerability Index, SOV.
Right, developed by the University of South Carolina. This index uses, I think it was 29 socioeconomic variables.
Things like race, age, income, gender, education, housing location, a lot of factors.
Yeah, a broad range. And it provides an overview of social vulnerability at the county level.
We saw a map referenced showing areas of high vulnerability in red, low, and blue.
That's the one. It illustrated, for example, that while Northwest Arkansas is categorized as medium-low vulnerability, much of the rest of the state shows higher vulnerability.
So it's a way to visualize where social needs might be greatest, regionally speaking.
It gives you that broader picture, yeah.
These are all important steps then. It shows that quantifying and considering social impacts are actively being pursued, even if it's really challenging.
They're definitely building blocks. Progress is being made.
Okay, speaking of new data sources and ways of understanding things, our material really highlighted the potential of social media in this space. That seemed like an area with potentially tremendous impact.
Oh, yeah. Social media is an unbelievably powerful tool for engaging the public, especially when things go wrong.
Like extreme weather events.
Exactly. During those events, it provides real-time content almost instantaneously, directly from people on the ground.
And it lets agencies capture public sentiment, right? Trends in behavior, emotions.
Yeah, to quickly gauge what people are thinking, what they need, how they're being impacted.
Yeah.
It's far faster than traditional surveys or reports could ever be.
Any specific examples?
The sources give some fascinating ones.
Sure.
A 2014 study by Suri analyzed Twitter data during the Moore, Oklahoma tornado.
Okay.
By looking at the most frequently used words, filtering out the common stuff like "da" and "a," they could identify key themes indicating urgent needs.
Like what?
Locations like Moore and Oklahoma identified affected areas. Relief highlighted immediate needs for help. And rebuild pointed towards the longer-term infrastructure requirements after the initial crisis passed.
Wow. That's a powerful insight for engineers, emergency planners, using this chaotic real-time data to see that progression from immediate survival to infrastructure recovery.
It really is. Similarly, a 2018 analysis by CADD looked at communication during Hurricane Sandy.
What did they find?
Identified public concerns like food, water, power shortages, alongside really detailed transportation topics. People talk about flight status, mass transit disruptions, subway closures.
Giving planners crucial real-time insight into what information the public desperately needed.
Exactly. Knowing what questions people are asking helps you provide the right answers.
And it goes beyond just monitoring, right? The material mentioned research developing models based on this data.
Yeah, models to actually optimize response efforts, like identifying optimal shelter locations based on where people are posting about needing shelter.
Or analyzing route congestion during evacuations from social media posts to help optimize traffic flow, maybe convert lanes.
Exactly that kind of application, using the data proactively.
And the importance for public transit agencies seems particularly striking. There is a 2014 study of the NYC MTA's Twitter account.
Right. By Chan and colleagues. It showed their typical follower growth was pretty small, less than 100 a day usually.
Okay.
But during Hurricane Irene, they saw 2,100 new followers in just one day.
Wow.
And during Hurricane Sandy, that number jumped to a staggering 13,500 new followers in a single day.
13,000. That really underscores that during emergencies, people actively seek out official sources for critical information.
And they are clearly doing that via social media platforms.
Yeah. Another study confirmed that, didn't it? In Melbourne.
The Pender study from 2014, yes. Looking at transit disruptions there, when unplanned disruptions happened, 86% of people turned to Twitter for information.
86%. Compared to what, Facebook?
33% for Facebook, 9% for YouTube. Twitter was clearly the primary source for those urgent updates.
So the benefits for civil engineering agencies engaging on social media seem pretty numerous then.
Definitely. It's a low-cost way to engage customers, provide timely updates.
Bypassing some of the traditional bureaucratic hurdles, maybe?
Potentially, yeah. Appearing more in touch, especially with younger users. And most importantly, reaching people where they are already communicating, especially when information is critical.
The sources also brought up this idea of proactive versus reactive social media use.
Right. Drawing on work by Evans and Cole back in 2012, most of the examples we've just discussed are reactive, responding to events, monitoring crises.
Okay, so proactive use would be what? Using it before things happen.
Exactly. Incorporating it into the planning process itself, using it to solicit public input and feedback before decisions are made.
They called it micro-participation because of the shorter communication lengths on social media.
That's the term, yeah. Not a full town hall meeting, but smaller, maybe more frequent bursts of input.
Makes sense. Was there an example of that?
A great one for the material was the Austin Strategic Mobility Plan. They explicitly used social media to gather public opinions on how to improve city transit.
And what came out of that?
The top 5 discussed topics gave planners direct insight into public priorities: traffic, bicycling, buses, cars, and passenger rail.
So seeing topics like bicycling discussed maybe more than buses, for instance.
Yeah, it gives you a clear signal about what the public values and where they see needs. It can help inform how those planning dollars might be allocated.
So definitely a valuable tool for communication and engagement, worth exploring more.
Absolutely.
Okay, moving beyond social media specifically, our material highlights that many foundational frameworks for the social pillar come from broader global initiatives, often rooted in the work of the United Nations.
Yes, you definitely see a significant shift in the UN's focus over time. Later documents give much more prominence to the social pillar.
Like that 2012 document emphasizing poverty eradication.
Right, and then the 2015 Sustainability Goals, the SDGs. Several are directly related to social aspects, things like no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being.
Quality education, gender equality, reduced inequalities.
Yeah, very socially focused. Very. And two prominent concepts emerging from this UN focus that our sources discuss are the Oxfam Donut and the Human Development Index.
Okay, let's start with the Oxfam donut. Oxfam, the organization's been around a while, right?
Since 1942, actually.
Yeah.
Started for food relief in Greece during World War II. Today, it's a global confederation working in over 80 countries
And their mission.
to help people lift themselves out of poverty and thrive. Their donut model is designed as a framework to create a safe and just space for humanity.
And the model itself, the visual, it represents this idea, doesn't it? The inner part is social issues.
Right, pulling directly from those UN goals, while the outer edge represents the planetary boundaries, the environmental limits we've talked about before.
So it intentionally connects the social and environmental pillars.
That's the key. It pushes us to think about how humanity can thrive, meet everyone's basic needs, while simultaneously staying within the Earth's ecological limits. It forces an interaction between those two concepts.
And that intentional connection prompts some really important, maybe difficult conversation.
Absolutely.
Right.
Like how people living in poverty often have the fewest resources and capacity to deal with environmental stresses.
Flooding, drought, extreme weather.
Exactly. Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans is often cited as a well-documented example where the lowest-income individuals were often the hardest hit and had the least ability to recover.
Right, the social vulnerability amplified the environmental disaster's impact.
Precisely. And it highlights the challenge that policies aimed at sustainability in one area can sometimes inadvertently increase poverty or create challenges in another.
Like the biofuels example, using land to grow fuel instead of food.
Yeah. A decision with environmental motivations, potentially, but one that can impact food security and potentially worsen poverty. It forces a question of priorities.
Okay, so that's the donut. Then there's the Human Development Index, HDI.
Right. Created back in 1990 by the United Nations Development Program, the UNDP, its explicit goal was to move beyond traditional economic metrics like GDP.
Gross domestic product, yeah.
To quantify development. The core premise of HDI is that people and their capabilities should be the ultimate criteria for assessing a country's development.
Not just how much wealth it generates.
Yeah, exactly. It aims to measure human well-being in a much broader, more holistic way.
And it incorporates 3 key dimensions.
Yes. First, having a long and healthy life, measured by life expectancy at birth.
Okay.
Second, being knowledgeable, measured by average years of schooling for adults and expected years of schooling for children entering school.
Education, got it.
And third, having a decent standard of living measured by gross national income, GNI per capita.
And it's noteworthy that standard of living is number 3, right? Not number 1.
Good point. And the goal is a decent standard, not necessarily maximizing wealth at all costs.
And while HDI is often used to compare developing nations, the sources pointed out it's still relevant for places like North America.
Yeah, because significant diversity in life expectancy, education levels, and living standards still exists within countries like the United States. It's not uniform.
Okay. And the HDI shows some clear global trends.
It does. Higher HDI generally correlates with lower under-5 mortality rates.
Which makes intuitive sense. Better health outcomes linked to higher human development.
Right. But here's where it gets really interesting and maybe challenging.
Okay.
What we see consistently is that higher HDI also correlates with a higher ecological footprint.
Ah. So better human development often means greater resource consumption.
That's what the trend suggests. The sources mentioned the global average footprint back in 2018 was 1.7 Earths.
Meaning humanity was using resources and generating waste at a rate requiring 1.7 planets to sustain it.
Correct.
That's a powerful, maybe uncomfortable trend. It suggests that improving people's lives, at least with current global patterns of development, often places a greater strain on the environment.
It certainly reinforces that idea from the donut model that policies in one area of sustainability can create significant challenges in others. There are trade-offs.
Yeah, unavoidable ones, it seems.
The sources also mentioned recent data tying HDI to technology access.
Like mobile phones and broadband.
Exactly. Significantly higher rates of mobile phone subscriptions and, importantly, fixed broadband connections per 100 people in high HDI countries compared to low HDI countries.
Which highlights how broadband is increasingly seen as critical infrastructure, right? Almost like water or wastewater systems.
Absolutely. A modern social necessity tied directly to infrastructure provision.
Okay, so we have these broad frameworks. What about another metric or analysis tool relevant to civil engineers that our sources covered social impact assessment, SIA?
Right. Social impact assessment, SIA. This is a structured process that reviews the social effects of proposed infrastructure projects and development interventions.
Kind of like an environmental impact assessment, an EIA, but for social stuff.
That's a good way to think about it. It essentially takes that EIA framework, which many engineers are familiar with, and applies a similar structured review process, but through a social lens.
And it focuses on specific types of social impacts.
Yes. The material listed 5 key types: impacts on lifestyle, on cultural aspects, on the community itself, on quality of life, and on health.
Okay, quite broad.
And like environmental product declarations or other pre-project analyses we've discussed, SIAs are performed before a project is initiated.
To help decide among potential alternatives.
Precisely. The 2006 SIA document we reviewed covers concepts like impacts on way of life, culture, community structures, political systems, even the environment's social aspects, health and well-being, personal and property rights.
And people's fears and aspirations related to a project. That's interesting.
It tries to capture that human element, and it looks at the project lifecycle too.
Planning, construction, operation, decommissioning, the usual stages.
Yes, similar stages to economic or environmental analyses. But the material emphasized that the planning and policy development stage is considered the priority stage for incorporating social concepts effectively. Get it in early.
Makes sense. And they use variables and indicators to try and quantify or qualify these impacts.
Yeah, looking at things like population characteristics, community structures, political resources, individual and family changes caused by the project, changes to community resources. Trying to pin down the effects.
Can you give us an example of how this works in practice?
Sure. The sources used an example from the Norwegian Public Road Association in 2007, looking at a road construction project.
Okay.
The assessment focused on both monetized, economic impacts and non-monetized impact.
It's like
Changes to the landscape or cityscape, visual effects, impacts on community life and outdoor recreation, effects on the natural environment, cultural heritage like prehistoric deposits and natural resources.
so really trying to value things beyond just money.
Exactly. They define small, medium, and large impact levels, noting whether the effect was positive or negative.
And what were the project options?
There were 2 main alternatives compared to doing nothing. Alternative A was upgrading the existing road that went through the town. Alternative B was constructing a new bypass road around the town.
Okay, upgrade through town or build a bypass. And what did the SIA show?
For Alternative A, upgrading through town, the assessment found generally positive economic impacts, but negative impacts on community life, outdoor recreation, the landscape, and cultural heritage.
Okay, and the bypass, alternative B.
That had negative economic impacts, but it was neutral or positive on community life, outdoor recreation, and natural resources. Though still negative on landscape and cultural heritage, both had some negative social effects, just different ones.
So a real mixed bag for both options. What was the final recommendation based on this SIA?
The recommendation was actually to upgrade the existing road, Alternative A.
The one going through town, even with the negative social impacts noted.
Yes. The sources note this was primarily based on the positive economic impact and being neutral or positive on natural resources.
So the economic factor still weighed heavily, even after identifying social downsides.
It seems so in that case.
Yeah.
That example really highlights the tension, doesn't it? You can identify the social impacts using SIA.
But the final decision might still prioritize economic or perhaps environmental factors over the social ones?
It does, and it shows that SIA is a tool for evaluation, for making those social factors visible, for considering things beyond just costs. Involves subjectivity, sure, but it's a step towards systematically incorporating the social pillar into project evaluation.
Okay. One last area our material touched on was the social purpose of corporations.
Right. Corporations obviously have an immense impact on society. The sources noted the world's 500 largest generated something like $2.7 trillion in revenue in 2018 alone.
Wow, they're massive actors.
Huge. So the theory here is, can we potentially leverage these corporations as drivers of positive change to help address social, political, environmental challenges?
That's the core idea. It's not saying companies shouldn't make profits, they need to be viable. But the focus shifts to going beyond only maximizing that single metric, despite, often significant pressure from shareholders to do just that. That's a fundamental shift in thinking about a company's role, isn't it?
It really is. The 2019 British Academy document provided some fascinating examples of companies explicitly trying to live this broader purpose.
Like who?
Well, take Novo Nordisk, the pharmaceutical company. Their stated purpose is to drive change to defeat diabetes and other chronic diseases.
Which might seem obvious for a pharma company.
But it contrasts with a maybe cynical view that their interest might lie in perpetuating chronic conditions rather than eradicating them, right? So that's a higher purpose.
Yeah, a purpose that might sometimes conflict with pure short-term profit maximization. Interesting.
Another example was Danone, the packaged foods company. Their purpose, provide healthy food to as many people as possible while ensuring everyone in the supply chain benefits, suppliers, consumers, owners.
A commitment to a broader set of stakeholders, not just shareholders.
Exactly. And Anglian Water, a British water company. Their purpose includes delivering long-term value for customers and the community and seeking positive outcomes for the environment and society.
Clearly stating a purpose beyond just making money for investors. It includes the well-being of the region, the environment.
It broadens the definition of success. And this mindset links directly to something you hear about more and more today, ESG.
Environmental, social, and governance.
Right. ESG is becoming a new mindset, an investment strategy even, that encourages looking at responsibility metrics and standards alongside the traditional financial ones.
So while traditional investing is purely focused on, basically, will the stock price go up based on financial performance?
ESG investing says, okay, we care about financial return, sure, but we also care about these other factors.
And it breaks it down into those three areas, E, S, and G.
Yeah. Environmental, E, how a company safeguards the environment,
Yeah.
reducing emissions, waste, that sort of thing.
Okay.
Social, S, how it manages relationships with its employees, suppliers, customers, the communities where it operates. Basically, it's internal and external human relationships. How does it treat people?
Right. And governance.
That's about the company's leadership, executive pay, audits, internal controls, shareholder rights, ensuring integrity and fairness in how the company is run.
And the idea from an investor's perspective is they might actually accept a slightly lower economic return if a company has strong ESG practices.
That's the premise for some investors, yes. It offers a more holistic view of a company's performance and its impact. The thinking is that responsible practices across E, S, and G can indicate long-term stability, maybe reduced risk, and contribute positively to the world.
Which some investors increasingly value alongside, or maybe even instead of just maximum short-term profit.
Exactly. It's a shift in values.
Okay, so we've journeyed through the economic, the environmental, and now the social pillars. We've really tried to define these three pillars of sustainability.
And it's clear, isn't it, that social pillar is incredibly complex. It's multifaceted.
Yeah, and the effort to truly understand it, to quantify it, especially in fields like civil engineering, that effort is very much ongoing.
It really is. It requires grappling with these fundamental questions about human well-being, equity, community impacts.
And leveraging everything from traditional principles to new tools like social media, global frameworks like HDI or the donut, analysis methods like SIA.
It's a constantly evolving field.
And it leaves us with a powerful thought to consider, doesn't it? Based on what we've explored today.
What's that?
We saw clearly that higher human development, as measured by the HDI, often correlates with a higher ecological footprint.
Right. The uncomfortable truth.
So, if improving people's lives, at least based on current development models, seems to place a greater strain on the environment, how can we truly reconcile these seemingly conflicting goals? How do we build a genuinely safe and just space for humanity that actually stays within the Earth's ecological limits?
That is the question, isn't it?
It really is. That's definitely a question that hangs in the air, inviting all of us, you, the listener included, to think deeply about the path forward.